time to stop swallowing that blue pill of corporate manipulation and remove the blindfold to a world not fabricated and mind-controlled by the media.
Enter a world of the twisted and deformed.
Step into the light. Discover the truth. It's time for a reality check.
Reality check. Reality check. Reality check. This isn't something you need to be afraid of.
Now, two of the most controversial views of the paranormal, as well as conspiracies, you'll ever hear. The hosts of Reality Check, Jessica Johns and Joey Mirabella.
All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome to week 6 of Reality Check. I'm Jessica Johns, sitting here with my awesome co-host, Joey Mirabella.
How's everyone doing tonight?
We're doing awesome, Joey.
Oh, good to hear. Good to hear. Good to get some positive feedback from the crowd sitting right next to me.
Tonight we're going to be discussing one of the most famous unsolved Hollywood murders of all time. Elizabeth Short, also known as the Black Dahlia.
This is definitely one of Jess's favorite topics. She's been talking about this for a long time. I know she's really, really excited. She is going to give us a great timeline of this woman's life. She was young. Unfortunately, it was one of the most gruesome murders that I've ever seen and heard of. It kind of is reminiscent of Jack the Ripper almost in some of the details of it. But I think that you'll all be in for quite a shocking and disturbing surprise tonight.
Especially when it comes to our suspect list.
Yes.
Oh,
yes.
Man. So I'm going to get right into it.
Get it started, Jess.
Yes. Okay. So I'm going to give you, a little quick overview of who she was. She was born Elizabeth Short, July 19th, 1924. Her parents were Phoebe and Cleo Short. Cleo actually built miniature golf courses. And in 1930, he disappeared and his car was found abandoned, almost like he faked his own death or disappearance to run away. I guess because the Depression hit and he had no way out. So then, she had 4 sisters and she dropped out of high school freshman year because at that point in time, it wasn't really important for women to have any kind of education. It was more, for men. For boys and men, I guess.
Yeah. That was when the glass ceiling was strictly enforced still.
Right.
Way back.
She was never a really promiscuous person, but she was always known as a tease, which we'll end up getting into later on. And she grew up in Medford, Massachusetts. She was best known for her body being found brutally murdered on January 15th, 1947 in a vacant lot near Leimert Park. Her body was found nude and posed by a local female resident, and she was only 22 years old. So I'm going to get into the timeline leading up to the events of her murder. Okay. So, going back to the 1940s, 1941, she spent the fall and winter months, cause she did live up north. So in the fall and winter months, she would go down to Miami and wait tables and meet the local servicemen. She had a thing for people in uniform. So
how rare for a woman, huh?
Right. So, but 1942, she spent all this time looking for her father. Okay. And she finally finds him and she starts corresponding with him. And eventually, 1942, she reveals to him who she is, the fact that she's his daughter, and he offers her a place to live because she found him in Vallejo, California. So she offers him he offers her a place to live. And so she moves in with him at the age of 19, and he was hoping that she'd be more of a live-in maid, but
which is bizarre, seeing as this is his daughter,
right?
Expecting her to move in and be his live-in maid.
If you're gonna stay in my house for free, live by my rules, clean,
be my maid,
keep the house clean, cook, keep the house clean, things like that. But she was always out partying. So then her dad kicks her out, and she ends up in LA working at the Camp Cook Army Base. Then in 1943, she's arrested in Santa Barbara for being in a bar underage. And instead of jail, the police they felt bad for her, so they arranged for her to go back to Medford, Massachusetts.
That was when those mugshots were taken, right?
Yes.
That are pretty famous now?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, she was 19. And really, like, what was going on was, like, she was in a bar, and the only reason she got caught was because her friends were acting rowdy, so they got kicked out, and then that's when they found out that she was underage. So 1944, she goes back to waiting tables in Miami, and that's where she meets Major Matt Gordon and Lieutenant Joe Gordon Fickling. And by 1945, she had fallen in love with Major Matt Gordon, but then he dies in the war. Elizabeth Short actually tells everybody that they were married and had a child that died in childbirth.
And that's entirely made up story.
Entirely made up story that never happened.
It's just sick in itself that she would make that up. Did you ever get a reason for why she was making that up? Was it just
no? But Major Gordon's family even denied that I'm sure they were together, but they were never married. Like, the story went from that her boyfriend died to her fiance died to her husband died, and then they had a son. Then in 1946, she gets back into contact with Lieutenant Fickling, who was stationed in Long Beach, California. So then he invites her to move out there and live with him. But then that ends. So she moves out like the first week of August, and that's when she meets Mark Henson at the Florentine Gardens. And she stays with him and rents out a room from him for a while. And she always, like, she had a lot of dates. Like, she went out a lot with different guys and different, the way they described it was different kinds of bums. Like, losers. Like, she went out with a whole bunch of losers, and she wasn't allowed to.
She was very naive, right?
Right.
They said she went out there. She's just an actress, or aspiring actress rather.
She wasn't allowed to bring men home, so she had to be dropped off a block away from the house or picked up a block away from the house, kind of thing. So in October, she meets this man. His name was Ed Burns, aka Maurice Clement, who was on the suspect list, and later on, I'll get into why he was on the suspect list. But he treated her really well, did the whole couples thing, like, his girlfriend. But after a while, she got a really bad feeling about him, and she asked him to send her to San Diego for a job opportunity. So December 6th, she gets on a bus and heads to San Diego. 2 days later, she finds refuge in a theater. It was called the Aztec Theater, and a woman who was a cashier there, her name was Dorothy French, and she finds Elizabeth sleeping in one of the chairs, and she feels bad for her, so she offers her a place to stay. She said, hey, you can stay with my mom for a few days if you need to. Well, what ended up happening was she ended up staying for like a month.
Overstaying her welcome.
Yeah, she overstayed her welcome once again, and so she was there for a month. That brings us to January 8th, 1947. Okay, so January 8th, she meets a traveling salesman named Robert Red Manley. They stayed in a hotel room that night. He slept on the bed. She slept on a chair. Nothing happened. He was a good man. He had a pregnant wife at home, and he would never do anything. While he admitted to being attracted to her, he was a good man and didn't do anything.
So he never had an affair.
He never had an affair. No.
Because that was one of those big rumors that was going around about this.
That's why he was interrogated for as long as he was, which ended up later on driving him to a nervous breakdown. But he offered her a ride back to LA. So January 9th, he drops her off at the Biltmore Hotel because she tells him that she's meeting her sister there. That was a lie. She wasn't. And he's got an appointment at 6:30. So he's already dropped her off and gone. He didn't even leave to make sure that she was safe. He just left. So she starts making phone calls to find somebody to stay with or ask for money, because she had no problems asking people for money, borrowing money, this and that.
She used her looks to her advantage. Like, she used that a lot to
right.
kind of get what she wanted. She knew she was attractive, but I think she realized that the power that she had. And they said one of the things they mentioned is that she had a lot of power because of how she looked, and used it. And it was one of the things that ultimately led to her, her death, is just because she wasn't aware of what she was really getting herself into, because she was very naive.
Right. The way that she would, I guess, like, be able to eat and everything was she would, bat her eyes and make guys, take her out on dates, and then she'd be like, okay, thanks, have a good night, and then just like leave. That was,
we know that word now to be called a tease. Right. That's the modern day word for it.
So eventually she finally gets a hold of somebody, which another suspect that I'll get into later on. And January 15th, like that was January 9th, 6:30. That was it. When she gets picked up, I think she got picked up a couple hours later after she made a whole bunch of phone calls. She walks outside, and that was the last anybody saw of her until her body was found January 15th by housewife Betty Bersinger, who was walking down the street with her 3-year-old daughter when she noticed what she thought was a department store mannequin in an empty lot, but it turned out to be the body of a woman. So this is the way that her body was found, Joey.
Yeah, this is really disturbing. You know, when they went into the details that whoever killed her went into in destroying her body was just brutal. They found her, like Jess said, cut into 2 pieces. It was a vacant lot west side of South Norton Avenue. And like Jess was saying, they thought it was a discarded mannequin just because of the condition the body was in. You know, it was entirely separated. I mean, imagine finding a body entirely separated, cut in half, separated from each other, laying on the ground. It was severed at the waist, completely drained. This is completely drained of blood. So I don't know what the point of doing that was. Almost some kind of sick, twisted vampire fetish there. The face was slashed from the corners of the mouth to the ears, which they call a Glasgow smile, which I looked into it, and that actually originated in Glasgow, Scotland, which was something that was popular with English street gangs back in the day. And they used to cut the mouths to make it look like that. Kind of like a Joker smile almost. But, you know, that's
I'm looking at him right now like I had no idea.
Oh, yeah,
that's pretty awesome. Way to go.
I just wanted to know what that meant. Like, what's a Glasgow smile? You know, I think of it as the Joker smile because of how her mouth was cut up. But she had entire portions of her thighs and her breasts sliced away, and her intestines were tucked neatly beneath the buttocks. And this is extremely graphic. I mean, in case you haven't noticed already, but
if you're under the age of 15, just turn your radios down.
Turn your radios up because you need a reality check. Turn the radio up.
Sorry, prosecutor crap.
There you go. We're still reflecting on Ken Kratz here several weeks later. So yeah, her intestines were tucked neatly. I like the word neatly beneath the buttocks. The body was in a pose with the hands over the head, elbows bent at right angles, and legs were spread apart. There were marks on the ankles, the wrists, the neck, where she had apparently been tied up. So she was bound somewhere. There were bruises all over the front and right side of her scalp. She had taken multiple blows to the head. They said that it could have been from the butt of a pistol, possibly, among other things it could have been. And
some of those wounds were done post-mortem.
After she was already dead, right?
Right.
Now, they did say, one of the things they said was they have a huge feeling that she was still alive when they started cutting her in half.
Well, yeah.
Which is, I can't even imagine. You know, I mean, no one wants to think about that. So she was alive for some of this, so she was definitely tortured to an extent. But after she was dead, I mean, the body was just mutilated. So, though you can't know exactly which part of this she ended up dying from, some say it was bleeding to death, some say it was hemorrhaging due to the severity of the damage to her head.
Or asphyxiation from choking on her own blood.
Yeah. So there's just a whole bunch of possibilities from how she died. But either way, I mean, the point is someone knew exactly what they were doing and did this purposely.
Let's talk about the autopsy rumors.
The autopsy rumors.
Okay, so all right, so one of the things that they discussed was there was a tattoo on her ankle. Okay, that they supposedly later found in autopsy. It was the
well, they were releasing the autopsy information, right? They weren't for what they were saying that information wasn't supposed to be available to the public,
right?
For whatever reason, which is unusual.
When her let's go back real quick. Like when her body was found, there were so many photographers, onlookers, and police personnel that trampled the crime scene and destroyed all kinds of evidence. But that tattoo on her ankle was cut off of her ankle and found during autopsy in a part of her body inside her.
Well, but there's mixed information,
right,
that we're getting here based on all the research.
That's why there's like the autopsy rumors, because it's not all confirmed. It's just rumor. Because
some of what Jess said we found, and then we also found some other information that may have proven that wasn't the case. So there was one theory that they had found that the killer had inserted an earlobe, as well as the tattooed flesh cut from her leg. So it was her leg or her ankle. This was inserted into her vagina. They put these pieces in there. But then there were photos that indicated that her earlobes were intact. So, that the flesh-bearing tattoo was removed only to avoid identification. So they said it was unlikely the killer would have left that with the body. So there's this mixed information that's coming out about this whole case.
But here's the thing. With that, to avoid identification, the way that they identified her body was through fingerprints sent to the FBI.
Right. Well, the news reporters were trying to get fingerprints from her, right? They were trying to blacken her fingers by burning the tips to try to imprint it, right?
Right. So they did send that to the FBI, and the reason why her name came up was because of her arrest in Santa Barbara. Right. So that's why, and then the other thing I found out was that Elizabeth Short had been pregnant at the time of her murder, and that information isn't as commonly known. No, that she was pregnant. No.
Which is huge.
There was, and a post-mortem hysterectomy had been performed.
Okay.
So there are all kinds of weird things. Like whoever the person that did this was really messed up in the head.
And then when the other thing is when they found her body, I think she was first found by that woman, but then news reporters came to the scene first prior to the police getting there. And these guys are just the epitome of just...
There's pictures of a dude taking pictures with her, like literally
posing,
like basically like a selfie kind
of
thing,
as if you were
in
Disney World in front of Epcot or something, like just sick. It was just messed up, just really sick, twisted people. They just, it was the kind of people that don't really care about the sensitivity of this situation. And these reporters even. They're from the Los Angeles Examiner. They contacted the mother. They contacted Elizabeth Short's mother before her mother even knew that they had found her daughter. And they pretended that her daughter had won a beauty contest because they were trying to pry so much personal information from her mother. This is what they did first. And then the reporters decide afterwards that they can't keep doing it that way. And then on the phone, they decide to tell her that, oh yeah, actually the reason we're calling you is because your daughter's been murdered. And her mother freaked out, and so they lied just to get information because they're just corrupt journalists. That's that kind of a thing. We see that all the time.
That's nothing new.
No, that's not new at all. The newspaper offers to pay for the airfare, for accommodations, so to get the mother to travel to Los Angeles and help with the investigation.
Well, the mother came down to identify the body. Her father refused to.
Okay. And but this is another thing though. The newspaper tried keeping her away from the police when the mother got there. The newspaper, they were the first ones to contact the mother.
Yeah.
So before the mother even had a chance to speak with the police, the newspaper wanted to get as much information on the scoop as they possibly could before they got to the police because they knew they would take over. So it was just a scheme to get the story out and be the first ones that had it before anyone else had that information. Which is, they don't, like I said, they don't understand the severity and sensitivity of a situation, like not even caring about the mother, the family, just nothing like that. So they didn't treat it with respect the way it should have been.
There were also witnesses that morning that claimed to have seen a black sedan in the early morning hours of January 15th, 1947. So her body was dumped that morning. So she could have been killed. Obviously, she was killed the night before, either the night before or in the couple of days prior to that. And like you said, her body was completely drained of blood and scrubbed completely clean. Clean.
So they didn't get any reasonable evidence that could link this to a specific person from the body just because it was so well scrubbed clean. Then there was also a lot of people that contacted the police and the newspapers saying that they had seen her between January 9th and 15th, but these all checked out to be false, right?
Maurice Clement claimed to have seen her on the 12th, but he was a suspect. He was also a suspect and claimed that he'd killed her that day. So
yeah, we're gonna talk a lot of this
suspect list.
There was a lot of suspects just coming out of the blue. We're gonna talk about that in the second half of the show. But yeah, other than that, there were also several people that I guess they got her confused with someone else, other women that they were mistaken for Elizabeth Short. So there was all this misinformation coming in and a million different outlets for people to try to explore to find out where this came from. But there was also the way they portray her. in general,
Yes.
the kind of person she is, which is controversial.
Basically, well, first of all, like when she met Mark Hansen and stayed at the Florentine Gardens, and she actually, not many people know this, but she did know Marilyn Monroe, and was before Marilyn Monroe was Marilyn Monroe. She was an up and comer and was
still the Norma Jean.
Signed, yeah, she was getting signed to studios, and Elizabeth Short was constantly asking her, what she needed to do, and she knew that she was good looking, and I guess there was a movie out that time called The Blue Dahlia.
Yes.
And
yeah,
so
right.
so her friends kind of started to call her the Black Dahlia because she had dark hair and she constantly wore a dahlia flower. So she played that up a lot. And like we said, she was very flirty with men and used her looks to her advantage, which again, like, she'd get into cars and go on dates and this and that, but she wouldn't put out, I guess is the best
she wouldn't
way
put that's the word. She wouldn't put out. She was a tease. But it was not that she was getting into car. I mean, she was getting in the car with strange men. Like, she didn't know these people. You have to take into consideration this was the 1940s, so these types of things didn't happen nearly as often as they do nowadays, where, don't get in a car with a stranger, don't take candy from a stranger, don't get into that white van that's coming down the road, You don't, but back then, this was not very common. It was, and they were saying it was common, men picked the woman up, drove them on dates, paid for everything, that was a classier era. So these things didn't happen very often. And like Jess said, she never put out, but then there was also that rumor that she was not actually even able to have sexual intercourse because
yes, she had infantile genitalia,
which
so she
also
was
means premature genitals.
Right, she was underdeveloped in that area, but that I think was another rumor.
Well, they also said that they never actually met one person that had ever really had sex with her either. They were that was one of the things. Right.
So then again,
no one actually ever said they did.
If nobody ever had sex with her, then how was she pregnant?
It must have been another one of those things.
It
must have been one.
There's a lot of discrepancies in her autopsy. I don't think anybody really we'll never know the truth.
No.
When it comes to it's
a very cold case.
We all know, listen, we all know she was cut in half. We know her story, aspiring actress. Hollywood basically chewed her up and literally spit her out. And
as they do with a lot.
Yeah, and her mouth sliced open ear to ear. She was sliced completely open, blah, blah, blah. But as far as like the other details are concerned, there was just so much differences in different stories of the autopsy. I don't think the real one, we're not really going to know what really happened to
LAPD
her body.
They had their hands full because they had to cross-examine every freaking piece of information that was coming in. And,
AKA the Manitowoc Police Department back in
yes.
1947.
Well, thank God they weren't on this case because we know where that would have went.
It would have been way worse.
Oh.
It's time to flip this iceberg and expose the truth.
This is gonna be good.
Welcome back to your daily dose of reality. To share your thoughts on the truth, call the KCOR Digital Radio Network at 702-425-9230.
Are you deaf?
That's 702-425-9230. Those around the world use Skype name KCOR Radio. Tweet your thoughts anytime to KCOR at KCOR Radio using hashtag KCOR. Enter the world of live chat at www.kcorradio.com.
Oh, that sounds dangerous.
Once again, it's time to cross that line of deception and bring you a reality check.
They're serious. They mean what they're saying.
With your mesmerizing hosts, Jessica Johns and Joey Mirabella.
All right, folks, we are back here on Reality Check. Again, I'm Joey Mirabella here with my lovely co-host, Jessica Johns.
That's me.
That's me. That was all of that, right? Like Nickelodeon?
Yeah, it was Amanda Bynes.
Wow, there's a trip back to the 90s. The best decade ever, FYI. So we're going to talk a lot about the suspects because there were so many of them that came forward. And this is the interesting thing, not just those that were accused or considered, but also people that started just saying that they had been involved with the murder. And it turned out to be this publicity stunt in a lot of ways. So there were, I guess, about 60 that confessed to the murder, which were mostly men, and 25 were...
Years, almost 60, 70 years later, people are still coming out of the woodwork. And
yeah, it's bizarre. I don't understand. But 25 were actually considered viable suspects by the LA district attorney, and then they said some of the original 25 were eventually eliminated, and then several new suspects were proposed, and it's just an ongoing issue. Who is it, and why are so many people trying to admit to something they didn't do? And just shows how weird and twisted human beings are, just to get a publicity stunt.
Well, some of those original 25 suspects are known abortionists. They're all, first of all, since she was cut cleanly in half, they concluded that whoever did it was a doctor. So
someone with surgical experience.
Right. So like half the suspect list was basically, they were known abortionists with criminal records. But there are
which was, by the way, highly back then. Abortion was highly illegal. Still, it wasn't something that you could actually just go and do. It was something that was considered really. I mean, it's still looked down upon in a lot of ways, but then you really weren't supposed to be doing that ever.
Right. So why don't you give us your top 3 suspects, and then I'll get into my.
Well, I'm going to give you one of mine, and then we'll go to yours.
Okay.
Because you have a whole bunch, and I know. Now, there's so many of them.
Actually, the one you have will shock us.
It will. I'm going to do that one. I'm going to save that one for later.
Oh, you're going to save that one for later?
That's my favorite one.
Okay.
So, but just an idea of how these people were coming forward. There was one guy named Leslie Dillon, who was a 27-year-old bellhop, aspiring writer, and he was actually a former mortician's assistant. And he wrote to the LAPD police psychiatrist, Dr. J. Paul de Rivera. And this was October 1948. He had lived in LA at the time of the murder, so he claimed, but then at the time was living in Florida. That's when he contacted the psychologist. So he had theories on the case, and he mentioned that he had an interest in sadism and sexual psychopathia and hopes that he could author a book on the subject. And he's telling the psychiatrist this, and he didn't confess to actually having done the murder, but he was saying that he had this friend named Jeff Connors who was a suspect. And eventually, de Rivera, the more he spoke to him and looked into it, started believing that Connors was just a figment of this guy's imagination, because they never were able to actually find anyone by that name. And so they started thinking that maybe Dillon was the one that did this. He's trying to, maybe he has some alter ego or something, or, he's a schizo, who knows. Eventually, they flew him to the West Coast, and they brought him up to San Francisco, which is where he said this guy was living. And they wanted to track down Jeff Connors, but they weren't able to locate him. So now, because this guy had so many details about the crime, he ended up being taken into custody. Connors was actually found to be a real person, but his real name was Artie Lane, not to be confused with Artie Lang, the comedian. Artie Lane. And he was employed by Columbia Studios, where Elizabeth Short did hang out a lot. But he couldn't be conclusively placed because of the whereabouts of January 9th and January 15th, 1947. So eventually, that one was entirely dropped. But basically what we're saying here is this guy, Dillon, he wanted to write a book. He wanted some information.
He had an agenda.
And
trying to get his name in the paper. But, speaking of Columbia Studios, so, like I said earlier, she met this dude in October of 1946. His name was Ed Burns. Turns out his name was really Maurice Clement, and he was really high on the suspect list because he was also a minion for Bugsy Siegel.
Yes.
Who...
Famous Bugsy Siegel.
Right.
Jewish mobster.
So Maurice Clement was also a procurer for the syndicate Call Girl Ring run by notorious Hollywood Madam Brenda Allen. So he treated her that way. He was I think the reason why she ended up leaving it in December was because she figured that out. He was trying to sell her into this call girl ring, and that's when she got a bad feeling and bolted. But like I said earlier, she said, or according to Ed Burns, he killed her on the 12th, and he cut her open to fit her in a suitcase. That's why she was, and then again, witnesses say that they saw a black sedan dropping her off early in the morning, or dumping her body. But again, he was just a suspect, and that didn't necessarily all the details, because in what he said that he had killed her in this hotel room, that he had signed them into the Biltmore Hotel and this and that he killed her there and in a bathtub, but there was no evidence to back that up.
He just said a whole bunch of
again. So next suspect.
Well, the other thing, you did bring up Bugsy Siegel, and I think one of the interesting things is you said this guy who wrote this book that we were looking at here, the Black Dahlia Files. Donald Wolfe was really convinced that Bugsy Siegel was behind this.
No, he had nothing to do with it.
No, yeah. He was, at the time, really occupied with the Flamingo Hotel in Las Vegas.
Yeah, he was. He spent all his time. He spent all his time between Vegas and L.A. trying to deal with that. He didn't really have time to murder somebody and do all the things that was done to her body. So,
and he was killed shortly thereafter.
Right.
Because he just, the Flamingo Hotel was failing, and that's why he was also so preoccupied, is because he wanted it to make money. He wanted this casino business to boom. So he wasn't doing anything with, he had nothing to do with Elizabeth Short. I mean, like, they did say she knew him.
Right. She did know him. She did. Seen him at parties at Florentine Gardens with Mark Henson, who was also on the suspect list because he was a jealous man, and she wasn't allowed to have boyfriends. When she stayed at his place, she wasn't allowed to have boyfriends. So he again, like I said, he was high on the suspect. Actually, he was lower on the suspect list than everybody else. But
it's just easy to blame the mob for a lot of things, and because they were behind. Everybody knows a lot of undercover conspiracies and everything, but he was not the one that did it, and we're pretty confident in that based on a lot of the other information we have. Now, this is one of the most interesting suspects that we found that was actually never even considered a suspect at the time. This information came out in 1999 when this woman wrote a book, and her name is Mary Passios, and she was actually a former neighbor of the Short family in Medford, Massachusetts. This is interesting. So she writes this book, and she is totally convinced that Orson Welles, the filmmaker who made Citizen Kane, famous movie, and a bunch of other films and starred in them as well, was a suspect. And there's a lot of reasons for it. One was he had a very volatile temperament. I guess you called it diphasic, which means he channeled creative frustration into aggression, and he, was almost like a different version of bipolar. He created these mannequins 3 months prior to Short's death that featured lacerations that were almost identical to the ones that were inflicted on Elizabeth Short. And he had these mannequins. He used them in this House of Mirrors set for his film The Lady from Shanghai that he was making around the time of this murder. But these scenes that were set in this House of Mirrors setting were deleted from the film entirely by Harry Cohn, and who was the president and production director of Columbia Pictures Corporation at the time. So those were never actually featured in the movie. But in one of Short's last letters home, her older sister Virginia claimed that she wrote that a movie director was going to give her a screen test. So Passios, the woman that wrote this book, says that Welles had a tremendous familiarity with the site where the body was found, and that Welles performed during World War II, several years before. This is back in 1943. He performed this famous magic act for soldiers, and it was called the Wonder Show. And he did this act called the Trunk Murder, in which he cut a body in half, and that's when he did these types of things that he was trying to display in a creative way that were just shockingly similar to how Elizabeth Short was found. And she believes this to be part of the killer's signature and acting out of a perpetrator's obsession. Now, this is where it gets really, really sketchy, in that on January 24th, 1947, which, by the way, and we never mentioned this, Jess, but the same day that the killer actually mailed a packet to the Los Angeles newspapers with all of Elizabeth Short's with information in there, the same day that the police received this packet, the passport, Orson Welles files for a passport. This is January 24th, 1947. So he leaves the country for an extended stay in Europe for about 10 months after the murder goes on. But the significant thing about that is that he was in the middle of editing Macbeth, which was a movie that he was directing and also starring in. So he doesn't even finish doing this. Republic Pictures was trying to contact him multiple times while he was still in Europe to get him to return and complete the film, but he refused to come back during these 10 months, which they never had a reason for. He just wanted to disappear and just not be there, which obviously is pretty interesting and intriguing in itself. So, according to Passio, she also interviewed several witnesses that stated that Wells and Elizabeth Short were both frequenting Brittingham's restaurant in Los Angeles during this same time period before she was killed, and these waitresses believe that Short was going out with someone from Columbia Pictures, but Wells was never considered an actual suspect at the time because I guess this information didn't come out till much later, which is very interesting.
You know, speaking of shocking suspects, there was a famous serial killer back in the 1930s. He's never really been identified, but he's got a little nickname called the Cleveland Torso Murderer, aka the Butcher of Kingsbury Run. Now, the Butcher of Kingsbury Run in the 1930s, he was like I said, he was never identified, but he often cut his victims in half, and he would keep them for long periods of time before disposing of them. Some people believe that he was also responsible for the Dahlia murder, since the crimes were so similar. But I'm getting ready to get into my number one suspect. And ladies and gentlemen, it is not.
Do we need a drum roll?
It is not George Hodel. It is not.
Jess hates George Hodel, in case we're wondering.
It was not. You know, I know that a certain buff over enthusiastic, we'll call him a quote paranormal investigator, claimed this guy did it, but guess what? He didn't. I think he was one of those people who was also a fame seeker trying to get his name out in the paper. But Joey did tell me earlier that they did release some dogs into his house and found that human remains had been.
They found that there was, because dogs can smell anything after decades,
right?
And they found I guess the scent of flesh, and so something had been there.
That just means that he did either do procedures in his house or he was killing people, but the Dahlia, not one of them, because he was a prominent doctor and everything, but he did hold parties and stuff, and there's a chance that she could have gone, but there are no witnesses to corroborate that, so no, he didn't do it.
But he did say something really stupid, and like you said, probably a publicity stunt, but Hodel did state that he says, supposing I did kill the Black Dahlia, they couldn't prove it now. They can't talk to my secretary because she's dead. And that was a quote that he said. So, when you're trying to convince people you didn't kill someone, that really isn't the smartest thing to say, but we're pretty convinced at this point that it was all a publicity stunt, like Jess said, and she really hates this guy.
I really do.
So we're not going to talk about him anymore because she's getting a look, so.
All right. So, like I said, January 9th, 1947, she's dropped off at the Biltmore, okay? And she makes a whole bunch of phone calls, and she remembers, she goes through her little book, and she remembers that her sister had a friend that knew this other guy, knew this nice couple, Walter and Ruth Bailey, and that if she ever needed help and if she was ever in the area, that she could call them. So finally, that's what she ends up doing. She calls Walter Bailey, and he finally comes and he picks her up, and she's expecting to see Ruth there, but she's not. Because Walter and Ruth had been separated because Walter had left his wife for his nurse. Now, his nurse, her name was Alexandra Partika, and she was a medical doctor from Vienna, except that she wasn't licensed to practice in the U.S. So she was just, she helped out with his practice. So anyway, so Walter Bailey, like I said, he was separated from his wife and everything. And then she had this, he was a prominent medical doctor. Like I said, prominent. When I say prominent, I mean like he was like the chief of staff at the LA County Hospital.
Probably the number one.
The number
in
one,
LA.
yes. And he was on the board at the University of Southern California. I mean, this guy, he was very, very respected in the medical field. So he comes and he picks her up, and she is with him this whole time. And he evidently had a brain condition. It was called...
What's the name? What's the word, Jess? Because it took us a little while to work on pronouncing this one. What was that word, Jess?
Encephalomalacia.
Encephalomalacia.
Oh, there you go.
Now, despite how sexy that word sounds,
we had to turn that. We had to actually look up the pronunciation of that on YouTube.
Encephalomalacia. Now, it's not really a sexy condition, but the word sounds kind of nice.
Which is the softening of the brain tissue, and it was a condition known to produce homicidal behavior. And Walter Bailey, he also had Alzheimer's. So now, okay, so this girl goes to him with her sob story. You know, she fell in love with this serviceman, and he died in the war. They had a son together, but he died, which infuriates Walter because
she didn't really have a son.
She didn't really have a son, and I think he figured that out, and I think that's probably one of the reasons why he killed her. But he also had a son that died. He was hit by a car riding his bicycle
on January 13th. That was
January 13th was his birthday.
Oh, that was his birthday?
Yeah,
okay.
They were getting ready to celebrate his birthday, but he
died at age 11 though.
He died at age 11. So I think that was probably a stressor. So that was one of the things that caused him. I mean, there were just so many things. And Walter Bailey, he also lived a block away. Really? A block away from the dump site.
And yeah, that was the one thing that they were trying to link this guy for a while, and that was no one could figure out why the body was dumped in this specific strategic location. And then they find out it was what his wife's near his wife, something like that. Isn't that what it was? That was living near where the body was dumped. It was his address.
It was. Walter was living there, but their residence was under his wife's name. His wife's name, okay. Now, the only reason that Walter's name even came up in the investigation, and this came up years, because he died a year later, and his name came up in the investigation because his wife and his mistress were fighting over Walter Bailey's estate.
Okay.
And then they started looking into it, and they were like, oh man, he's a doctor. This dude's a doctor, and he specialized in basically plastic surgery, like what we would call today liposuction. And
yeah, he used to cut fat out of people before they had the vacuums to do it. They did it the old-fashioned way,
yeah,
which is a lot more painful.
Right.
But this was another really twisted thing, in that they used to, him and his mistress at dinner time, they used to watch movies of surgeries and autopsies. Now, I know nothing gets my appetite going like watching an autopsy on a dead body. I'm sure everybody agrees with that. So, it's just one of those disturbing facts that, why would you be doing that kind of thing? I mean, I understand it's your profession, but it's just, they would regularly watch these kinds of videos, which is just disgusting. So, I mean, they would have some issues.
Right. They didn't really go out to eat much. Instead, again, they would order in and hang out, and that would be their time together. And
how romantic.
Yeah. So to me, that is my prime suspect. But again, we will never know. Like I said, he died a year later. But again, the body. Let's talk about the body, though. The body was scrubbed clean, completely clean. No DNA is going to be found anywhere on that body. It was treated as a sex crime, but no DNA found on that body.
So there could have potentially been some kind of sexual violation of the body, but if it was scrubbed so clean, they didn't find anything. Nobody's gonna know. Nothing. No fingerprints. Nada. Nothing.
Plus, again, the crime scene was tampered with. Yes. And one of the reasons why, not only, like I said, because of the onlookers and the photographers and the newspaper journalists and police personnel, but because it got to be so crazy that they covered her with a blanket also before they prematurely covered her with a blanket before they could get all the evidence gathered. So that's gonna ruin some evidence right there. And there's just,
one of the things I want to, because we were talking about this, we kind of put together our own little idea of what may have been involved, because it may necessarily have been more than one person involved in the actual murder.
Let's talk about our Orson Welles conspiracy.
So because I'm so into the Orson Welles theory, but I don't believe Orson Welles was actually the one that killed her, because she was seen with Orson Welles quite often at this restaurant, because there were witnesses that said that. There also were other actresses, by the way, that claimed that Welles had tried to rape them. That was actually true. There were other actresses. Yeah. So he was a little bit of a character back in that time. There were some allegations against him, but The theory that we're kind of thinking now is because he had so much power in Hollywood, and we know how much power Hollywood has because we just explored our Kurt Cobain case last week. And when you have money, you can do anything. You could pay people off. You could cover anything up. And because, Elizabeth Short was really a nobody still, ironically became a lot more famous after she died, we think that, like Jess said, she was pregnant, right?
Yes, that was part of the autopsy
Right.
report. It was that she was pregnant.
Whose baby do we seem to think that it could have been that would want her to be killed if she was pregnant with a baby? Could it have been Orson Welles, who she was frequently seen with? Mm-hmm. Could he have had a reason or an agenda to have her killed by someone else, some very famous predominant surgeon in Los Angeles?
Walter Bailey. That's why I kind of stress that he was like the surgeon of all surgeons, like LA County. Like I said, chief of staff, LA County. He was on the board of directors at USC.
He performed abortions too, right?
Yep.
So it's possible Wells may have sent her for an abortion or wanted her to get the abortion.
It's a small world after all, because she knew Walter Bailey, but he probably placed a phone call or something. Like she probably brought his name up in some kind of conversation, and
maybe she didn't want to get the abortion.
Maybe. And then he calls Orson Welles like, hey, I have your gal here and she's saying this, and he's probably going kill her.
Yeah. He's probably losing. He's like freaking out, losing his mind. And it would make perfect sense for him to suddenly disappear as soon as he could, right after she died, right after they found the body.
Right.
And it would make perfect sense for him to not want to come back for no reason to finish him. I mean, this guy was a fanatic with his movies and directing, so for him to not want to come back and finish something that he was working on was just it wasn't in his nature. It was weird. It was strange. So we have a lot of suspicion that these two were actually connected in it together. There may have been some collaboration.
Every time he wanted to, what's weird is like every time he wanted to try to get back together with Ruth and his family, Alexandra would blackmail him about their little secret. Like, if you get back that's fine, go back with your wife, but I'm telling everybody you killed her, that you were the one that killed Elizabeth Short.
And that's how she keeps him tied up.
And that's how she kept him tied up that whole time until he died a year later. I think he died of a heart attack. Okay.
Well, either way, I mean, again, this is a cold case, and it's unfortunately we'll probably never know exactly who really committed the murder, who really killed her.
If this murder had happened like recently, we probably would have been able to find out. That's what they said. Yeah. If we would know we would have known who had done it. So we want to thank everybody for listening to our Black Dahlia episode tonight.
Hope you all learned a lot. Yeah. Look into it yourselves, come up with your own theories, but we're pretty proud of the one that we came up with.
Right. So join us next week and every Wednesday at 9 o'clock. I'm Jessica Johns.
And I am Joey Mirabella. We really hope to see you, I use that loosely in quotes, next week. Tune into our show, Reality Check. Hope you enjoyed it.
Come get tacos from us tomorrow.
Or the next day. Thanks very much, guys. We hope you all have a great evening.
Stand by. You've been listening to Reality Check, the one show that doesn't prepackage and spin the truth as propaganda. Hosted by Jessica Johns and Joey Mirabella.
I see incredible potential here.
Live every Wednesday night at 9 p.m. Pacific, 12 a.m. Eastern, exclusively on the KCOR Digital Radio Network. For more information on the show, the hosts, as well as social media links to Reality Check, please visit their page on the KCOR Digital Radio Network.
We know that they provide strong motivation for decision-making teenagers.
It's time to stop letting someone else control your mind and explore the truth hidden within. Reality Check. Reality Check. Reality Check.